Filipinos, there were Iranians, there were Turks, there were Indians from all parts of the subcontinent who looked up to Japan. And Tagore was especially impressed by the Japanese visual arts, as I have mentioned in the course of this lecture. But whenever he went to Japan, and beginning in 1916, he cautioned Japan against following what he saw as European-style territorial nationalism and nationalistic imperialism. And he clearly was completely dismayed when Japan invaded, China full scale in 1937. And Subhash Chandra Bose, as well as would be clear from the little excerpt that I read from his, Japan's role in the Far East sort of essay, was actually condemning Japan. And in 1938, when Subhash Chandra Bose was president of the Indian National Congress, he sent a medical mission to China. However, when the war broke out, Subhash Chandra Bose decided that he would take advantage of the international war crisis, because he felt that he had been part of the Indian independence movement since 1921. He joined Gandhi's nonviolent non-cooperation movement that year. And he had been in that movement for 20 years. And while the civilian masses of India had all come forward and joined the movement, Indian soldiers had been kept successfully insulated from the anti-colonial nationalist movement by the British colonial masters. So he felt that the war gave him an opportunity to get access to them, many of whom happened to be prisoners of war held by Britain's enemies, and try to get them to change their loyalty from being loyal to the King Emperor to swearing a new allegiance to the cause of the Indian nation. So that is how Subhash Chandra Bose sort of justified his wartime decisions, his wartime strategy. And we don't know for sure what Tagore might have thought of that, because even though he knew that Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose had escaped from India in January 1941, and I should mention here that the nephew who drove him on the escape from Calcutta happens to be my father. He was a 20-year-old medical student then. But Tagore died a few months later in August 41. So he knew about the escape. He was aware that Netaji had gone abroad to seek support for India's independence movement, but he would not have been aware of the full ramifications of the story, because Japan did not enter the Pacific War and did not enter Southeast Asia until December 41. To cut a long story short, I think that Japan's role historically was clearly that of a colonial and imperialist aggressor in Northeast Asia when it came to Korea and China. But the story was more complicated in relation to Southeast Asia, because in South and Southeast Asia there was a longer history of Western imperial rule, British, Dutch, French, American in the Philippines, and the Japanese played at least an instrumental role in destroying the power of these, Western imperialist countries. And that is why, in the context of the Second World War, there were many figures, such as Subhash Chandra Bose of India, Aung San of Burma, even Sukarno of Indonesia, who willy-nilly took advantage of that situation, tried to get some Japanese help to further their own cause. There was always this, of course it was the Chinese, whether in China or in the Malay Peninsula in Singapore, who faced the brunt of Japanese brutalities. And it's only really decades after those events that both the Chinese and the Indians in Southeast Asia are beginning to come to understand and appreciate each other's predicaments. China was the victim of Japanese aggression. India was still under British colonial rule, a very exploitative and an oppressive kind of rule, which contributed very directly to the 1943 famine, for example, in which 3 million people died. And so that's the context in which the wartime, decisions were taken. I should add that even in 1943, Subhash Chandra Bose was advocating that Japan should withdraw troops from China and come to an honorable peace with China. But by that time, Chiang Kai-shek had been accepted at the high table by Roosevelt and Churchill and had no reason to listen to the pleas of a, Indian freedom fighter. But it was a problem that troubled Indian leaders, intellectual as well as political. Japan's aggression in China, which they recognized, was completely undermining the spirit of Asian universalism to which they aspired.
Thank you. Yes. Microphone.
This is much more of a comment than a question. I was absolutely thrilled to hear you talk about Penang.
Can you speak closer to the mic, please?
Oh,
yes.
sorry. Association with Tagore and Netaji. I don't know if there's anybody else in this room who was around in those days when Netaji visited Penang. I met him then. I was a child, but I was there. My family was very much involved in the INA. Father, sister, brother, they were all part of it. And what thrilled me so much was to hear you talk about the, I suppose, the universality of the INA, that it was Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and so on. Now, one of the things that you mentioned just now about the two national anthems, Bangladesh and India, when we were children, and this is the point that I hear so little spoken of, we sang Jono Gono Mono in Hindi. And I find so little reference to it everywhere. Why has that happened?
Yes, thank you for your comment. Yes, in today's lecture, I could only mention in passing, the kind of universality of the Indian National Army bringing together all of the religious communities of India. Certainly, it was a shining example of Hindu-Muslim unity, which even Mahatma Gandhi praised a great deal at the end of the war. And if one thinks of it, it was a Christian officer of the Indian National Army, Cyril John Stracey, who built the INA Memorial on the sea face in sort of Singapore. There is something else to be added. The British had a theory, a rather spurious anthropological theory of martial races and castes. And so the British only recruited the martial races into the British Indian Army, Punjabis, Pathans, Gurkhas, and so on. Now, the Bengalis and the Tamils, for example, were quintessentially non-martial races. But what Subhash Chandra Bose was able to do was not just recruit professional soldiers, many of whom happened to be Punjabis and Pathans, and Punjabis of all religious communities, Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, but there were many civilian recruits into the Indian National Army in Southeast Asia because there was such a large civilian population. Many of them were just Tamil rubber plantation workers who joined as soldiers of the INA. So the different regions were also integrated into the Indian National Army. And Netaji typically spoke in Hindustani, which was a mixture of Hindi and Urdu, but because of the large Tamil population in this part of the world, there were instant translations into Tamil that were made available. And you're absolutely right. The Indian National Army had a music department, and there was a really very talented songwriter called Mumtaz Hussain, who wrote many beautiful INA songs. I mean, the inspiration of the INA soldiers were their leaders' speeches and the music. हम दहली दहली जाएंगे, हम अपनी हिंद बनाएंगे, और कदम कदम बढ़ाए जा, खुशी के गीत गाए जा, and so forth. But you're also absolutely right in suggesting that Jana Gana Mana Adhinayaka Jai was accepted as the national anthem by Netaji. Bande Mataram was also sung, but already in Germany, he had accepted Jana Gana Mana Adhinayaka Jai as the national anthem in 1942, and it was actually played by an orchestra there. Here, because he was himself a Bengali, he made sure that Jana Gana Mana Adhinayaka Jai was translated into Hindustani, a mixture of Hindi and Urdu, The original Janagana Mano Adhinayaka Jaya He has 5 verses, but 3 of those verses were rendered into Hindustani. It was not a translation, but a rendering, capturing the spirit of the song Janagana Mano, and it was Subha Sukha Chayanaki Barakha Barase Bharata Bhagya Hai Jaga. It was in fact sung in Hindustani. It was sung when the provisional government of Azad Hind was formed on the 21st of October 1943. Yes, it is not entirely forgotten, let me add. It is still sung. It was the 100th anniversary of the composition of the song Janagana Mano Adhinayaka Jaya He in December last year, because it had been composed in December 1911. While the Bangladesh anthem was written even before, in 1905, Amar Sonar Bangla. Now that too was a favorite song of Subhash Chandra Bose, and he wrote it down in his own hand in his jail notebook, Amar Sonar Bangla Ami Tomaye Bhalobashi. But at the time of the centenary of Janagana Mano Adhinayaka Jaya He, it was remembered that Netaji was the first to adopt it as the national anthem, and what's more, had it translated into Hindustani, and between 1943 and 1945, in fact, it was sung in Hindustani all across Southeast Asia. So it's not entirely forgotten. And the last that my mother was present when it was sung, I had just left that meeting. Lakshmi Swaminathan, Lakshmi Saigal, passed away recently, and there was a memorial meeting for her in Delhi on the 2nd of August in a big auditorium in Delhi. And there, at the conclusion of the meeting, everybody stood up and sang the Hindustani version, Subha Sukha Chayanaki, as the national anthem.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. It now gives me great pleasure to ask His Excellency, the Indian High Commissioner, to say a few words of thanks. The Indian High Commission has played a very important role. This whole series of Tagore lectures would not have been possible without their generous support and initiative. So it gives me great pleasure to invite you to say a few words and also to present a souvenir to the speaker. Yes, please.
Thank you, Dato Anwar. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to thank Professor Dr. Sugata Bose for his lecture today on building bridges across the Bay of Bengal, in which he so lucidly covered not only Tagore's role in connecting India and the then Malaya, and in particular Penang, but also highlighting the role of another great Indian nationalist and freedom fighter, Subhash Chandra Bose, otherwise known as Netaji. It is indeed fortuitous that the first Tagore lecture last year was delivered by the great-grandnephew of Tagore himself, and that the second one is now being delivered by the grandnephew of Subhash Chandra Bose, and also the Bose family has a long historical connection with the Tagore family of Bengal. So I think that it's very fitting, and it's going to be rather difficult to find a third person to match these two, but I'm sure that we'll think of something. I also want to acknowledge the presence of Mrs. Krishna Bose, the mother of Dr. Sugata Bose, who has been a 3-time member of Parliament and also was chairperson of the Standing Committee on External Affairs, which is one of the more important committees in the Indian Parliament, and of course has been tirelessly working for decades on keeping the institution of the Netaji Research Bureau going, which I understand is probably the best archive of primary sources relating to Subhash Chandra Bose's work and his life. I want to, of course, thank Dato Anwar for the whole idea of the Tagore lecture. Had he not taken my wife and me to the Huyosie quite by chance 2 years ago, I don't think the Indian High Commission would even have known that there was a building in Penang of which the foundation stone had been laid by Tagore and which was still in existence, because most of the buildings where Tagore delivered speeches in Kuala Lumpur have of course been razed to the ground, and these modern structures have come up. And this includes the St. Francis Institution, the Victorian Institution, and so on. Lastly, I want to thank the Penang Heritage Trust for its excellent work in trying to bring about more knowledge of Penang in the Indian Ocean. Because I think that, well, for the last 50 years, all we have heard about is the Atlantic Alliance initially when the Cold War was on, and then when the Cold War ended, it became the Pacific Century. But I really think that we've all forgotten that actually the Indian Ocean connected much of the trade in the 19th and 20th centuries, and it's going to be even greater in the 21st century because, as Professor Bose said, the economic balance is shifting back towards Asia. With these few words, I want to thank everybody for coming here and for also giving an opportunity to the Indian High Commission to support an activity of this kind in Penang. Thank you.
So thank you all very much. We look forward to seeing you at the next Penang lecture, which will be on Japan, this anniversary of the invasion. And then in December, another amazing story of the world's greatest inventor, Buckminster Fuller, and his connection with Penang. So we look forward to seeing you. Thank you very much. And thank you very much also, Dr. Sinha, for your presentation. Good evening. Thank you.
That is a very special day, and it's not an accident.